Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to act as your personal tutors, really, to help you master Chapter 18.
Right, Chapter 18, Spontaneous Change. How fast? From the textbook Chemistry, Human Activity, Chemical Reactivity, 2nd edition.
Exactly. And, usually we expect chemistry to be immediate, like you mix 2 clear liquids in a flask and suddenly there's a bright yellow puff of smoke.
Or a sudden precipitation of a solid crystal.
Right. We have this deep-seated expectation that chemical change is instantaneous. But the reality of chemical processes, especially the ones happening inside your own body right now, is, well, it's an intricate kinetic waiting game.
Oh, absolutely.
Take your digestive system, for example. When you eat a bowl of chili or, say, some roasted broccoli, you are ingesting these complex sugars. They're called oligosaccharides.
Yep, those are the ones.
Your body wants to break these down through hydrolysis. And according to the laws of thermodynamics, that breakdown is a completely spontaneous reaction. It is highly favored to happen. But there is a massive catch.
There really is. Because those sugars are kinetically inert in the environment of the human gut.
Kinetically inert.
Right.
Yeah.
So thermodynamics tells us the reaction wants to proceed, but kinetics dictates the actual speed. And at normal body temperature and pH, the uncatalyzed rate of this hydrolysis is just agonizingly slow.
So wait, the reaction is spontaneously favored, but the molecular reality is that it just takes far too long to be of any biological use on its own.
Exactly. Because that natural breakdown is so sluggish, those intact sugars actually bypass normal digestion. They continue straight into the colon.
And that is where anaerobic microorganisms basically throw a fermentation party.
A very gassy party, yes. They feast on the unbroken down oligosaccharides, and the byproduct of that microbial feast is gas. Carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and methane.
Methane, which, we experience as a minor, perhaps uncomfortable daily inconvenience. But when we scale up that exact same kinetic bottleneck to global agriculture, it becomes a literal planetary crisis.
It really does. Ruminant livestock, like cows, have similar anaerobic methanogens in their stomachs, fermenting those tough plant sugars. And the scale is staggering.
Yeah, the text highlights a wild fact. Globally, ruminant livestock produce roughly 80 million tons of methane every single year because of this slow hydrolysis.
80 million tons. That accounts for 28% of all global methane emissions related to human activity.
28%. And considering methane has, 72 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period?
Roughly, yeah. So this microscopic reaction rate directly impacts the Earth's radiation balance, which makes the chemical intervention so fascinating.
Right, the solution. Biotechnology companies actually engineered a specific strain of the fungus Aspergillus niger to produce a pure enzyme.
Alpha-galactosidase.
Exactly. We introduced this natural catalyst into the system, and it specifically targets those oligosaccharides, vastly accelerating the hydrolysis reaction.
So the sugars break down into absorbable forms long before they ever reach the methanogens.
We are essentially manipulating the speed of time at a molecular level to solve a global warming mechanism. It's wild. Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp how we can control that speed, we need to understand what a reaction rate actually is.
Well, reaction kinetics, at its core, is just asking how fast. Previous chapters asked if a reaction will happen. That's thermodynamics. Kinetics asks how fast it will happen.
So is it like measuring the speed of a car just with molecules?
Sort of, but we aren't measuring distance. The rate is simply the change in the concentration of a reactant or a product over a specific change in time.
Okay, so concentration over time.
Right. If we plot the decomposition of a molecule like sucrose in an acidic solution on a graph, the y-axis is concentration and the x-axis is time.
And you don't see a straight diagonal drop.
No, you see a curve that starts steep and gradually flattens out. We can measure the average rate over a large window, say the first 2 hours, by finding the slope of the line connecting hour 0 to hour 2.
But the reality of a chemical reaction is dynamic. I mean, an average doesn't tell us how fast the reaction's moving at exactly hour 4.
Exactly. To find that instantaneous rate at a specific moment, we'd have to draw a tangent line tucking the curve at that exact moment and calculate its slope.
And looking at that curve, the tangent line gets flatter and flatter as time goes on. The instantaneous rate slows down.
Which makes perfect physical sense. As the reactants are consumed, there are just fewer molecules left to interact. The action inevitably fades.
So what actually makes a reaction go faster in the first place?
Well, that comes down to collision theory. For any chemical reaction to occur, the particles, whether they're atoms, molecules, ions, they must physically collide.
Right. If they don't occupy the same space at the same time, no bonds can break or form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, any condition we impose that increases the frequency or the intensity of those collisions will speed up the reaction.
So concentration is the most obvious lever to pull, right? Higher concentration means more molecules crowded into the same volume of solvent.
Yeah, it's like putting 100 cars in a small parking lot instead of 10. The frequency of collisions inevitably skyrockets.
Makes sense. And then you have surface area for solids.
Right. If I drop a solid chunk of a reactant into a solution, only the molecules on the outer skin of that chunk can participate. The inside is trapped.
But grinding it into a fine powder exposes exponentially more molecules to the surrounding reactants, drastically multiplying the available collision sites.
Precisely. And temperature is the third crucial condition. Heating a system doesn't just increase the number of collisions, it fundamentally increases the energy of those collisions.
Okay, so now that we know what speeds up a reaction, how do chemists mathematically predict it? Because here's where it gets really interesting, or maybe a bit confusing for students.
You're talking about rate equations. The dependence of rate on concentration is written as rate equals K times the concentration of A to the power of M times the concentration of B to the power of N.
Right. K is the rate constant. But the confusing part is those M and N exponents. It would make so much sense if a reaction's order, those exponents always matched the balanced chemical equation.
That is a persistent and dangerous assumption. The reality is that the reaction order can only ever be determined experimentally.
You cannot deduce the rate law just by looking at the overall balanced equation.
We really can't. A classic example from the text is the decomposition of ammonia gas, NH3, on a heated platinum surface.
Okay.
The balanced equation dictates that two molecules of ammonia decompose to yield nitrogen and hydrogen gas. So you might logically assume the reaction is second order with respect to ammonia.
Because of the two molecules.
Mm-hmm.
But the experimental data shows something bizarre. It is a zero-order reaction.
Yes, meaning the rate equals the constant K multiplied by the concentration of ammonia raised to the power of 0.
And anything to the 0 power is 1. So the rate is entirely independent of how much ammonia is in the system.
Right. You can pump 10 times more ammonia gas into the chamber, and the reaction doesn't speed up by a single millisecond. It proceeds at a totally fixed, constant speed.
That is wild. Why does it do that?
The underlying mechanism explains it. The reaction only occurs when ammonia molecules physically attach to the surface of the solid platinum catalyst.
Oh, I see.
Once every single available microscopic binding site on that platinum surface is occupied by an ammonia molecule, the surface is saturated.
So any additional ammonia gas you pump in just bounces around in the void, waiting in line.
Exactly. The rate is bottlenecked by the physical surface area of the platinum, rendering the concentration of the ammonia gas mathematically irrelevant to the speed.
That makes the method of initial rates so essential. You really have to isolate the variables in a lab to figure this out.
You do. You run the reaction, hold reactant B constant, double reactant A, and measure the immediate change in speed.
If the speed doesn't change, A is 0 order. If the speed doubles, A is first order. If the speed quadruples, it's second order.
Exactly. But a rate law only tells us the speed right now, in this exact moment.
Right, so what if we want to predict the state of the reaction an hour from now, like predicting the future of a reaction?
That requires integrated rate equations. They connect concentration directly to time. By using calculus to integrate these rate laws, we derive equations that can be plotted as straight lines.
And students can use these straight line graphs to test data, right?
Yes. If you plot the raw concentration of your reactant against time, just concentration versus time, and it forms a perfectly straight declining line, the reaction is 0 order.
But if that raw concentration plot yields a curve, we know the rate is dependent on the diminishing amount of reactant left.
Right. So to straighten out that curve, we manipulate the data. We plot the natural logarithm of the concentration against time.
Natural log of R versus time.
Yeah.
And if that transforms our curve into a straight line, we've proven it's a first-order reaction.
Exactly. And if the natural log plot still yields a curve, we test for a second-order relationship by plotting the inverse, 1 divided by the concentration against time.
And a straight line there confirms a second-order reaction.
Right. Each of these mathematical models describes a fundamentally different physical reality of how the molecules are depleting. which brings us to the concept of half-life.
The time required for a reactant's concentration to drop to exactly half of its initial value.
Yes, and crucially, for a first-order reaction, the half-life is an absolute constant. It is completely independent of how much material you start with.
Wait, really? So if you begin with 1,000,000 molecules and the half-life is 10 minutes, it takes 10 minutes to drop to 500,000.
Yes.
But it also takes exactly 10 minutes to drop from just 100 molecules down to 50.
Exactly. The physical reason for this constant half-life is rooted in that proportional decay. Because the instantaneous rate of a first-order reaction is directly proportional to the number of molecules present, having fewer molecules means the reaction slows down by the exact same proportional factor.
So the shrinking concentration and the slowing rate perfectly offset each other.
You got it. Leaving the time interval required to have the population rigidly constant.
Okay, so we've seen the math, we know how to measure and predict these macroscopic changes. But let's zoom into the atomic level. Sectioning off a tiny region of space, what is actually happening physically to the molecules during these fractions of a second?
Well, let's go back to that collision theory.
Right, the car analogy. Like if two cars bump into each other in a parking lot at 2 miles per hour, they just bounce off intact, nothing happens. But if they crash at 60 miles per hour, the metal deforms and they rearrange into a mangled new shape.
The text actually uses a great egg analogy for this. Eggs brought into contact gently retain their identity, right? They don't break.
But colliding with speeds beyond a threshold level causes a messy rearrangement.
Exactly. Molecules experience a very similar threshold. Merely touching is insufficient. For a collision to result in a chemical reaction, the molecules must smash into each other with a combined kinetic energy that equals or exceeds a specific minimum threshold.
The activation energy barrier.
Yes, and we can visualize this using a reaction energy diagram.
Oh, I love these graphs. So imagine a graph showing the potential energy of a tiny system as the reaction progresses. Let's take this specific example from the text. Nitrogen dioxide, NO2, colliding with carbon monoxide, CO, to convert into NO and CO2.
Good example. As these two molecules hurtle toward each other, their electron clouds begin to repel.
To keep moving closer, they have to overcome that massive repulsive force, which means their potential energy climbs sharply. They're basically being forced up an energy hill.
The absolute peak of that hill represents the transition state. This is an incredibly brief, highly unstable configuration.
It's the moment where the old chemical bonds are stretching and breaking, and the new bonds are simultaneously beginning to form.
Right. And the total energy required to push the reactants from their starting baseline up to that unstable peak is the activation energy, or EO.
And for this specific reaction, that climb demands 132 kilojoules per mole of kinetic energy.
Once they crest that transition state, the oxygen atom fully transfers. The newly formed molecules relax, and their potential energy plummets down the far side of the hill.
So what does this all mean for temperature? I mean, does heating it up shrink the hill?
That is a very common misconception. No, the hill remains exactly 132 kilojoules high, regardless of temperature.
Okay, so the mountain doesn't change.
Right. What heat does is shift the statistical distribution of energy among the molecules. By raising the temperature, we widen that distribution, giving a significantly larger fraction of the molecular population enough kinetic energy to clear the EA hill.
So it's essentially giving a massive group of hikers the stamina to climb an impossibly steep mountain. The mountain is the same, but suddenly thousands of hikers can reach the top instead of just 3.
That's a great way to put it. And mathematically, we use the Arrhenius equation to calculate that activation energy from the straight line plot of the natural log of K versus 1 over T.
But it's not just about brute force, is it? Even if they have the energy, don't they have to hit each other at the exact right angle?
Yes, orientation matters heavily. If our NO2 molecule smashes into the carbon monoxide with enough energy, but hits the wrong side of the carbon atom, they just bounce off.
So we know molecules have to climb an energy hill and they have to hit perfectly. But do complex reactions happen in just one giant lucky collision?
Almost never. Statistically, the odds of 3 or 4 different reactant molecules colliding at the precise required angle with the exact required energy in the exact same millisecond are practically zero.
So how does anything complex ever get made?
Most reactions happen in a sequence of elementary steps, bond-making and bond-breaking events. We call this the reaction mechanism.
Okay, think of it like an assembly line building a car. You don't just dump all the parts into a bin, shake it up, and a car pops out. You build it in stages.
Exactly. Each of those isolated elementary steps has its own molecularity, meaning it could be unimolecular or bimolecular, or on rare occasions, termolecular.
And if the guy putting on the steering wheel on the assembly line is incredibly slow, it doesn't really matter how fast the engine is installed, right? The overall speed is limited.
That connects perfectly to the concept of the rate-determining step in a mechanism. The overall rate of the complex reaction is entirely dictated by its slowest elementary step.
The absolute bottleneck. And when we dissect these multi-step mechanisms, we often discover intermediates, right?
Yes, intermediates are high-energy species formed in one step and consumed in another.
So they never actually show up in the final overall balanced equation. They're just temporary.
Right, they act as temporary structural scaffolding during the mechanism.
So bringing it all back to catalysts, how does our hero from the beginning, the enzyme alpha-galactosidase, actually work?
Well, a catalyst doesn't just push molecules harder. It doesn't raise the temperature.
It provides an entirely new mechanism, right?
Exactly. It provides an alternate pathway with a lower activation energy hill.
So because the hill is physically smaller, more molecules can naturally make it over the peak at body temperature, vastly increasing the reaction rate.
You got it. The catalyst emerges at the end, completely untouched, ready to repeat the cycle.
It is such an elegant solution. We've really covered a lot of ground today. We started with gassy foods and methane emissions, learned how to measure the speed of chemical changes using rate laws.
We graphed their concentrations over time with integrated rate equations.
Right, and we visualized molecules smashing into each other to climb those energy hills using collision theory.
And finally, discovered how catalysts like enzymes carve tunnels right through those hills by changing the mechanism.
It really shows how mastering the speed of chemical change is arguably just as powerful as understanding the reactions themselves.
And it leaves you with a pretty provocative thought to mull over. The text highlights that ruminant livestock produce 28% of human-related methane, and we are using kinetic principles and engineered fungal enzymes to speed up gut reactions to fight global warming.
It makes you wonder.
Exactly. What other massive global crises are simply waiting for the right chemist to find the exact mechanism and lower the activation energy of the solution?
That is an incredible thought to end on. Whether we are carving tunnels through energy mountains or just trying to understand the speed of our own biology, kinetics really is the power to rewrite reality.
Absolutely.
Well, on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, I want to thank you for joining us in Mastering General Chemistry today. Good luck in your studies, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.